Now it's working. Good. Good morning, everyone, and welcome here to Nevi Shalom, and welcome to this weekend teaching on Gluk Mahamudra. I think hopefully you've all got a copy of the text. We'll be going through that. Maybe it's already been mentioned, but if you've got mobile phones with you, make sure they're switched off, not even on silent. You don't want them vibrating or beeping during meditations. The schedule is that we'll be running 4 sessions today and tomorrow. There'll be 2 morning sessions with a little 30-minute tea break in the middle. So the first session will run from 10 till 11:15, and then we'll have a 30-minute tea break. So then from 11:45 till 1 o'clock is the second session, and then lunch will be from 1 till 2. And then this afternoon we'll have 2 sessions again from 2 till 3:15, a 30-minute tea break till 3:45, and then another session finishing at 5 o'clock. So that's the schedule today. Tomorrow's schedule is quite similar, except we'll be starting half an hour earlier. So my session tomorrow will start at 9:30 in the morning, and we'll have similar program schedule for tomorrow then. So the text that we're going to be following is this one here. And in fact, this weekend is the second of 2 weekends. So we began this text 2 years ago, and we sort of covered the first half of the text. So this weekend we'll cover the second half of the text, but I'll start with a brief review of some of the main points that we covered in the first half, because probably forgotten, and maybe many of you weren't here the first half of the text 2 years ago either. And so we're just going to there's a lot of material here, so the idea is just to sort of focus on the main points, and of course we're going to be doing meditations in every session as well, because no point in just gathering intellectual knowledge if we don't know how to put it into practice. So we'll be doing meditations in each session following the text. So maybe we can start with just a little summary of the first page here, the name of the text and so forth. So the text that we'll be following is called The Main Path of the Victors, a root text for the precious Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra. So first we'll start with this word Mahamudra. Mahamudra is a Sanskrit term which we can divide into 2 parts. Maha means great. And mudra here means stamp or seal. The word mudra also can have other meanings. For example, in meditation we'll often talk about hand positions, different hand positions as being mudras, but that's not the meaning of the word mudra here. Mudra here means stamp or seal. So what we're talking about here is that we're talking about the idea of emptiness. Emptiness is coming from the Sanskrit term shunyata, and emptiness is describing nature of reality, how things exist, and that's going to be the main topic, of course, for this weekend. And what we're saying here very simply is that everything's empty of independent existence. Nothing exists independently. And so here the idea of stamp or seal is that emptiness stamps or seals all phenomena, meaning that all phenomena are empty of independent existence. Nothing exists independently. So everything is stamped in that way by emptiness, because emptiness is the ultimate nature of all phenomena. So that's what the idea of stamp or seal is. And Maha here means great. So what that is referring to is that if we realise this emptiness, we realise the nature of reality, then we can achieve the great goal of liberation from suffering. Hence, great seal or great stamp. And here, when we talk about emptiness in the context of Mahamudra, we're not just talking about emptiness in general, we're really talking about emptiness with respect to the mind. And so therefore, this Mahamudra system of practice is often called nature of the mind practice, because we are investigating nature of reality through investigating the nature of our own mind. How does our own mind exist? And so that's what we're going to be looking at over this weekend. And here it says that the main topic, the main title of the text is The Main Path of the Victors. Victor here is a translation of a Sanskrit term, Jina, and it's just another term for Buddha. So here the term victor implies that a Buddha has gained victory over something. And what a Buddha has gained victory over is what's called the two obscurations, which we're going to look at a little bit more detail later in the text. But very briefly, the two obscurations are the afflictive obscurations and the cognitive obscurations. The afflictive obscurations is simply our mental afflictions. So that's things like attachment, craving, jealousy, anger, everything that these mental afflictions that afflict the mind. So by doing this Mahamudra practice, we can overcome all of our mental afflictions. But also we can overcome these what's called cognitive obscurations. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, what that is later. But very simply, it's stopping us from seeing reality as it is. Because now when we look out on the world, everything appears to exist completely independent of us. And that is the cognitive obscuration, that we are blocked from seeing reality as it is. And so when we can realise nature of the mind and become a victor, become Buddha, we can overcome these cognitive obscurations, this mistaken appearance that we receive. And here in the text it says that it's the main path of the victors, meaning that if we want to also overcome these obscurations and achieve liberation, this is the main path. We need to realise the nature of the mind. And it says this is the root text for the precious Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra. So maybe we can back out a little bit to see where this Mahamudra practice fits in the sort of the bigger Buddhist picture. When Buddhism first spread from India, it originally spread through the Pali language. And the sort of the core of the teachings that spread at that time were the Four Noble Truths, the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And this spread into Sri Lanka and then up through Southeast Asia. And so all of those Buddhist traditions now, when they go back to the original text, will go back to the text written in the Pali language. And these Buddhist traditions collectively now are called the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And in these traditions, the goal of the spiritual path is nirvana. This is a state of liberation from all suffering and its causes, all mental afflictions and suffering. But also Buddhism spread through the Sanskrit language from India. And here, when it spread, the sort of the core of the teachings that spread through the Sanskrit language were these, what's called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, Perfection of Wisdom teachings, which is the teachings all about emptiness. And this spread from India up over the Himalayas onto the Silk Route and across into China, Korea, Japan, down to Vietnam, and also the Himalayas into Tibet. So all of these Buddhist traditions, when they go back to the original text, will go back to the text written in Sanskrit. And now, collectively, these Buddhist traditions are called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And in these Buddhist traditions, the final goal of the spiritual path is complete enlightenment. And a little bit later, we'll look at what's the difference between nirvana and enlightenment. And it really comes down to what we talked about here. A victor, someone who's achieved enlightenment, has overcome both of these. To achieve nirvana, we only need to overcome the first one. But if we want to achieve enlightenment, we need to overcome both. So that's sort of very simply the difference, but we'll unpack that a little bit more later. It says here that the root text for the precious Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra. So Mahamudra is a system of practice that is within the Mahayana. But here it's talking about the Gelug Kagyu tradition. So these are two schools within Tibetan Buddhism. So when Buddhism spread into Tibet, initially it spread around the 8th century, and the system of teachings that was brought into Tibet initially was called Dzogchen, and that formed the basis of what's called the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. And then a little bit later, some more different systems of teaching came from India to Tibet, and they formed the basis of the other three schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The first of those is called the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. And the system of teachings that was brought here into Tibet from India is called Mahamudra, the topic for this weekend. Another school formed of Tibetan Buddhism called the Sakya, and the system of teachings here brought into Tibet is called Lamdre, Paths and Results. And then the fourth school, of course, is the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. And the system of practice brought into Tibet here is called Lam Rim, means stages of the path to enlightenment. So what we see here is that this text is the precious Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra. So what that means is that the system of practice that come into Tibet, Mahamudra, is forming the basis of the Kagyu school. But then a little bit later, in the Gelug school, this was really established by great Tibetan master Lama Tsongkhapa. He also received teachings from the Kagyu school. And then, based on those teachings, he then introduced this system of Mahamudra called the Gelug Kagyu tradition. So what we have then is this system of Mahamudra is really within the Gelug school, but of course it's using a lot of the instructions from the Mahamudra system of practice in the Kagyu school. So any of you had any teachings on this, you'll find quite some similarity here. So that's the context for what we're looking at this weekend. Is we're looking at this Mahamudra practice, this nature of mind practice, coming within the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. Any questions so far? So I like to be very interactive in my teaching, so if you ever have any questions, then just raise your hand and we'll address the questions as we go along. Question? No. Okay. So that's sort of the background, and of course the author here, Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen, is very famous in Tibet. This word Panchen actually it's interesting because it's an abbreviation of two words. The first word is Pandita, so Pan is short for Pandita, which actually is a Sanskrit word which means scholar. And Chen is short for Chenpo, a Tibetan word meaning great. So Panchen means great scholar. So the Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen was not only considered a great scholar, he was considered a great meditator as well. And any of you who have some experience in the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism probably have heard of him. He was the tutor of the 5th Dalai Lama, for example, but he wrote many tantric texts. So in the Gelug school, the Guru Puja that's often done, that's written by Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen. Medicine Buddha Puja, written by Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltsen, and many other texts as well. So he was very well-known teacher and scholar. Question?
Yeah, for the four schools, when you mentioned the main practice of the Gelug, the Lamrim was, as it presented when the people present or teachers present, the Lamrim, they say this common to these all four traditions, as it arises. Atisha was actually presenting this, so Atisha was definitely influencing Gampopa, who wrote the Kagyu tradition and the Sakya.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, of course, we can unpack this a lot more, but I just kept it very simple. So that's true, is that in the Mahamudra system of practice that was brought in, then when that came in and down to Gampopa, as you mentioned, he also synthesized these Mahamudra instructions with the Lamrim to form the Kagyu school. So, yes, there's a lot more we can talk about. I just wanted to keep it sort of simple and not get too complex in understanding. But that's true. There is certainly some cross overlap in a lot of these schools. And you also find that, for example, here in the Nyingma Kagyu, the Dzogchen Mahamudra, you also find, because both of them are really nature of the mind styles of practice, you find a lot of overlap between these two schools in terms of various texts, various practices that are in common to those schools. Another practice which is a little bit related to that, called Che, the sort of cutting practice, that's also something that is commonly practiced in all four schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So there is a lot of overlap there. But if we keep it simple, then we can use those four systems of practice in those four schools. Okay. So then let's go to the text. So if we go on to the first page, And so we've covered the first, I think about last 2 years ago, we covered up to the bottom of page 6. So I'll just sort of briefly run through some of the main points here. So what we see there is that up the top of page 1, the text is sort of divided into 3 parts. There's the entering into the composition, the actual explanation, and then dedication of virtue. The entering into composition, this is something very common in the Tibetan Buddhist texts, that this section will have a sort of a praise or a homage to something or someone, and then a promise to compose. And here we see that Panchen Losang Chegi Gelsen is paying homage to Mahamudra and also to his teacher, and then he's making a promise to compose. So that all comes in that first section there of activities for entering into composition. But if we go to the actual explanation, we see that this is divided into 3 parts: preliminaries, actual practice, and conclusion. And so here, preliminaries is really the foundation practices that we need to engage in to have a good basis for Mahamudra practice. And so here we see in the first sentence there, under preliminaries, it says, in order to have a doorway for entering into the Dharma and a central pillar for the Mahayana, sincerely go for refuge and generate bodhicitta without these being merely words from your mouth. Before I explain a little bit about that, you see here that some of the text is bold and some is normal. So in the title, it says root text. So root text is usually very short. So what you find is the actual root text is what's in bold. And all the other text is being added from a commentary. And it's very common that when a great master writes a root text that is very dense and very brief, they will also then write a commentary explaining that. And so that's what we have here, is the text that's not bold has been inserted from Panchen Losang Chögyal Gyaltse's own commentary on his root text, so that we can understand it a little bit easier with a little bit more information. So that's what we have in this text here. So this text is actually the root text plus a bit of commentary from the Panchen Lama himself. So here it says that to have a door of entry into the Dharma and a central pillar for Mahayana, go for refuge and generate bodhicitta. So we can talk about door of entry. And so the door of entry into the Buddhist path in general, of course, is refuge. Refuge here is to go for refuge to Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So what that means is that when we have faith or confidence that the Buddha, his teachings, and the spiritual community following these teachings, if we have faith and confidence that they are really going to help us and they're a valid form of refuge, then we have this refuge, and then we can be said to be entering into the Buddhist path in general. But of course here, this Mahamudra is in the context of the Mahayana, in the context of striving for the goal of enlightenment. So there, the door of entry is we have to, in addition to this refuge, we have to develop bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a Sanskrit term. Bodhi is actually enlightenment, chitta is mind. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. So bodhicitta is our aspiration for enlightenment. So that is the door of entry into the Mahayana path to enlightenment. First we have to cultivate this aspiration for enlightenment. So that's bodhicitta. So that's what it says here. So if we want to enter into this Mahamudra practice, then we need to not only have this refuge, but we need to cultivate this aspiration for enlightenment, this aspiration called bodhicitta. But of course also it's not only the door of entry, it's the central, it says here, central pillar, central support, which means all of our practices in Mahamudra are supported on the motivation of bodhicitta. If we don't have the motivation of bodhicitta, then it's not really Mahamudra practice. And it says we are to cultivate these without them being merely words from your mouth. And so therefore, what we find in the context of preliminaries, we find what's called the 4 common preliminaries that will help to direct us towards going for refuge and generating bodhicitta. And we actually see this on your last page. You have this prayers for meditation. So any practice in the Mahayana, again, as a door of entry, we often start the practice with this going for refuge and generating bodhicitta. But you see here that it's preceded by these 4 thoughts. And these are what's called the 4 common preliminaries. These are 4 practices that will help us to really go for refuge and generate bodhicitta without them being merely words from our mouth. And so we see 4 things here. The first one, it says, this precious life of leisure and opportunity is rare and easily lost. So the first contemplation or practice here is to reflect on precious human life. That we've got a human life full of opportunities to help us appreciate the situation we're in and therefore want to make our life meaningful. So that's the first point. Otherwise, if we don't realise this precious opportunity, we often sort of waste our life in quite meaningless activities. And the second reflection here is the world and those within it are impermanent. I too will die soon. So that is to help us to understand and appreciate that, yes, we've got a precious opportunity now to make our life meaningful, but it's not going to last forever. So let's make use of our life while we still have it. And then those 2 reflections will really then inspire us to make our life meaningful and to do it right now while we still have the opportunity. But how are we going to make our life meaningful? Well, the first step is, the third reflection is, the results of my virtuous and non-virtuous actions will without fail ripen within me. So this is the reflection on the causality in terms of our actions and our experiences. So this third one is to really appreciate that if we do harmful behaviour, we're going to end up with suffering. If we end up doing good things, we'll end up with a good result. So then, by really reflecting on that, that would inspire us to adopt an ethical lifestyle. So that's the first step in making our life meaningful, is adopting an ethical lifestyle. And then to take that one step further, we can look at the 4th one. It says here, and since there is no genuine happiness to be found within the abodes of samsara, I must correctly practice the true Dharma. So then the 4th reflection is to understand that, to realise that there's no genuine happiness to be found out there anywhere. Because that's where we're looking for happiness, out there. And so in this 4th reflection, we can really appreciate that not only is the source of genuine happiness, but the source of our suffering is coming from within our own mind. Then we can turn the mind inwards. And so that's what means, the 4 thoughts means the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. To turn the mind inward, to look for the source of happiness and suffering within, and to strive thereby to be liberated from suffering. So then if we do these 4 reflections, then we can really sincerely go for refuge and generate bodhicitta. And so that's what is in the preliminaries here, the common preliminaries. But then following that, we have a paragraph here which it talks about the 4 guiding instructions. These are what's called the 4 uncommon preliminaries. And we see here refuge, bodhicitta, vajrasattva, meditation, mandala offering, guru yoga. So these preliminaries here are preliminaries or foundation practices that really help us to establish a foundation for the highest level of practice of Tantra or Vajrayana. And we'll briefly look at that, what that means, that Tantra or Vajrayana practice, shortly. So these are the practices that we would engage in to really establish a foundation for that level of practice. And then if we go over on the page 2 into actual practice, here at the beginning we see Even though there are many ways of approaching Mahamudra, they can all be classified as either Sutra Mahamudra or Tantra Mahamudra. Which means this Mahamudra